Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. County records place the first entry of this case in early spring of 1992, after several residents of the quiet hollow of Briar Creek reported persistent disturbances coming from an abandoned homestead near the ridge line. The area itself sat in one of the older stretches of the Appalachians, thick with birch and hemlock, its soil soft with decades of unbroken moss. Nothing notable had ever happened there, aside from the occasional bear sighting and the slow erosion of unused trails. But that year, a new family had moved into the long-neglected cabin at the edge of the hollow, the Mercer brothers, Elias and Frederick, descendants of a line that had once lived in those mountains generations earlier. Their arrival caused mild curiosity among locals, especially since the cabin had been vacant since the 1960s. According to the land deed, their grandmother had owned the property, though few remembered her clearly. The Mercer brothers kept to themselves. Elias, the older, was pale and thin, moving with a stiffness noticed even on the day they arrived. Several townsfolk remarked that he walked with a strange rhythm, almost like a marionette. Some attributed it to an old injury. Others quietly referenced a neurological condition, drawing comparisons to certain inherited disorders occasionally documented in medical literature, such as the degenerative pattern seen in Huntington's disease, which researchers in the early 1990s were actively studying with new genetic tools. No one pressed the matter. Frederick seemed healthier, though withdrawn. He handled most of the errands in town, purchasing canned foods, kerosene, and an unusual amount of heavy cloth. He avoided conversation but always kept polite. The first disturbances occurred within weeks of their arrival. A farmer named Lowell Hantry claimed he heard a sound like dragging iron late at night coming from the Mercers' direction. His affidavit in the county file states plainly, "Not wheels, not tools, something slower." Another neighbor, Mrs. Parson, reported seeing faint lamplight moving behind the cabin at odd hours. These accounts would have been dismissed normally, but on April 19th, Marshal Henry Coates received a letter from a visiting hiker who had passed near the ridge. The handwriting was shaky, the wording uncertain, yet the message was clear. A man was in the trees but not standing right. The phrasing troubled Coates. He rode up to the property the next morning, finding only Frederick outside. The younger Mercer insisted everything was fine and explained that Elias often walked at night due to restlessness from a long-standing condition. His tone was sincere, but his eyes carried something strained beneath. Coates left without incident, but as he descended the ridge he noted disturbed soil along a narrow path, drag marks, shallow but consistent, not from boots, not from animals, something between. He wrote in his log that evening, "Not enough evidence to act, but the brothers bear watching." Within days, more reports surfaced, voices in the trees, figures seen only peripherally, and once, a shape crouched near the creek bed that vanished when approached. It was the beginning of a pattern the hollow would later struggle to understand. The old cabin the Mercer brothers occupied had always carried a quiet reputation. Local elders recalled that the Mercer line once lived deep in the mountains, rarely descending into town. An 1897 church ledger mentions the family only twice, first for a baptism, second for an illness that was not spoken of openly. The wording was vague, but later generations remembered whispers of hereditary affliction, though no one agreed on its nature. When Elias Mercer returned in 1992, some residents privately wondered whether the family affliction had resurfaced. Elias' movements, abrupt shifts, delayed responses, echoed certain inherited neurological disorders described in early genetic case studies, including the involuntary motions noted in medical literature on Huntington's disease. But no one dared ask him directly, and Frederick avoided any topic that approached family health. Through late April, Briar Creek settled uneasily into a strange routine. Daytimes were quiet, nights were not. Families along the hollow kept lamps burning longer, discouraged children from wandering, and reported muffled noises drifting from the ridge, soft thumps, faint rattling, and once, a sound like someone striking bone against stone. Marshal Coates rode up again on April 27th, this time following a report from a trapper who claimed to have found blood where there shouldn't be any. The trapper, Silas Brune, was known for exaggeration, but Coates inspected the area regardless. Near the creek's bend, he found a patch of discolored earth, reddish-brown, fresh, but without prints. No drag marks, no animal disturbance, just a single smudge trailing toward the Mercers' property, thinning until it vanished entirely. Coates documented it and continued uphill where he found Frederick splitting wood. The younger Mercer greeted him calmly. Elias was nowhere in sight. When asked about the noises and the discolored soil, Frederick offered tight explanations. Elias wandered at night, he sometimes fell, he sometimes bled, his condition caused clumsiness. Coates pressed gently, asking whether Elias needed medical support. Frederick shook his head, saying only, "It runs in the family, it always has." The marshal noted that line carefully. Toward dusk, as Coates prepared to leave, a door inside the cabin slammed loudly. Frederick flinched. Coates, instinctively reaching for his holstered flashlight, asked if Elias was well. "He gets restless when days grow short," Frederick replied, forcing a smile. "It's better if he walks it off." No further details were given, but as Coates rode back down the slope, he caught a glimpse, just briefly, of a figure standing behind the cabin. Thin, hunched, arms held stiffly at his side. Elias, presumably. But the posture was wrong, almost contorted, as if his limbs responded to signals out of rhythm with one another. Coates described the sight later as a man assembled from mismatched instructions. By early May, new disturbances rippled through the hollow. Livestock went missing, first a goat, then chickens, then a small hound belonging to the Parson family. No traces were ever found. A few residents claimed they saw movement at the tree line near midnight, something low and quick, yet upright. An uneasy rumor spread that something at the Mercer cabin was not simply sick, but changing. It was during this tense period that a schoolteacher named Clara Atwell submitted a statement noting a strange encounter on her walk home, one that would prompt the first official investigation into the Mercers' genetic history. Clara Atwell's statement, filed on May 6th, was brief but unsettling in its clarity. She walked the old footpath from the schoolhouse at dusk, a route she had taken for years without concern. About halfway down the trail, she noticed someone standing beside a narrow hemlock, motionless, watching. At first she assumed it was Frederick, since he often ventured into town during late afternoons. But as she drew closer, she realized the figure's proportions were wrong. The arms were longer than they should have been, the shoulders uneven, and the head tilted sharply to one side as though listening to something behind itself rather than in front. When she stepped off the path to approach, the figure moved, not away but sideways without pivoting its torso or legs. A gliding shift, unnatural and abrupt. "It kept its face toward me," she wrote, "but not its body." She froze, the figure froze. Then, in a stuttering motion, it withdrew into the trees. Not running, not stepping, just disappearing through the darkness with jerks like a faulty machine. Clara returned to town in tears, insisting it was a person, yet not entirely. Marshal Coates did not dismiss her. Similar descriptions were beginning to accumulate in private conversations, figures standing wrong, moving wrong, watching from behind tree trunks at improbable angles. Coates rode to the Mercer cabin again the next morning. This time, he found Elias outside. Elias' appearance had worsened dramatically. His eyes twitched in irregular patterns, his jaw tightened and released without rhythm, and his fingers curled and uncurled, as if responding to invisible instructions. The behavior reminded Coates, though he did not write it in his official notes, of a degenerative neurological condition he'd once seen described in a regional newspaper about a family in the mountains who carried a rare genetic disorder. In the early 1990s, genetic research on inherited diseases, including Huntington's, had been widely discussed, and symptoms like involuntary muscle movement were regularly cited. Elias insisted he was fine, though his voice broke between syllables. When Coates asked to check the cabin, Frederick emerged, blocking the door. He apologized but said his brother had been overwhelmed and needed rest. The refusal was polite but absolute. That same evening, a violent disturbance erupted near Briar Creek. Residents reported an animalistic shriek echoing down the ridge, followed by crashing branches and the panicked bleating of cattle. By the time families reached their pens, several animals had broken through their enclosures, fleeing into the woods without apparent injury. Something had frightened them badly. One farmer, Edmund Carver, claimed to have seen a figure crouched in the shadows just beyond his fence line. He described it as tall but bent, like a man whose spine had too many hinges. In his affidavit he wrote, "It shook like it was cold, but the night was warm." Coates gathered these accounts and visited the cabin for a fourth time on May 10th. He found the door slightly ajar. Frederick greeted him with forced calm, while Elias was nowhere in sight. When Coates asked where his brother had gone, Frederick hesitated too long before answering. "He wanders. He doesn't mean harm. It's in our blood to move this way when it starts." Coates asked what it was. Frederick did not answer. After leaving the cabin, Coates found disturbed soil behind the property, deep impressions that suggested someone had knelt repeatedly in the same spot. Nearby, he found a piece of torn fabric, stiff with dried sweat and faintly smelling of iron. Back in town, rumors shifted from illness to something else, something altered, something inherited but changed beyond recognition. Folklore in the Appalachians had long included stories of people who went wrong in the deep woods, but this case felt different, measured, progressive, and increasingly dangerous. By mid-May, the Mercer cabin had become a point of whispered dread in Briar Creek. Residents avoided the ridge path, and children were warned not to play near the creek bed after sundown. What unsettled the town most wasn't noise or sightings. It was the pattern. Every encounter, every glimpse, every disturbance seemed to follow a progression, as if something was emerging stage by stage. On May 14th, Marshal Coates received a letter from a retired nurse named Dorothy Kellam who lived 2 hollows over. She claimed to have treated members of the Mercer family decades earlier and wrote cautiously about a familial condition that caused severe nervous system deterioration. Although she never used medical terminology, her descriptions echoed accounts common in early research into genetic diseases: movements out of sync, cognitive decline, unstable gait. She emphasized that the condition worsened unpredictably and once caused a relative to vanish into the hills during a period of delirium. Dorothy's letter made a discreet reference to case studies similar to those surrounding Huntington's disease, without naming it, suggesting that the Mercer bloodline may have carried an inherited disorder long before Elias and Frederick returned to the hollow. Her letter concluded with a chilling line: "If the old pattern is repeating, you must keep your distance when confusion begins turning into instinct." Coates read it twice, then rode back to the cabin. This time he found the place empty. The door hung open, rocking slightly in the warm breeze. Inside, the cabin was dim and disordered. Blankets had been dragged across the floor, and several jars of preserved food lay shattered in the corner. One kerosene lamp had been knocked over, leaving a blackened scorch mark on the wooden boards. But the most disturbing find was in the back room, deep scratches along the wall, low to the ground, spaced unevenly. Not like claw marks, not like tools. They resembled the irregular drag patterns of elbows, knees, and forearms, as though someone had repeatedly braced themselves against the wall while their body convulsed. Coates documented everything, noting that the air carried a sharp metallic smell. He later admitted privately that the odor reminded him vaguely of blood, though no visible traces were found. Outside the cabin, he discovered something stranger still, a series of shallow depressions in the soil, arranged in a spiral. Each indentation was palm-sized, spaced about a foot apart. The spiral widened outward, forming a pattern that looked unintentional yet unmistakably deliberate. Coates knelt and touched one of the impressions. They were fresh, edges still crisp, undisturbed by wind or animal prints. It was as if someone had circled the cabin repeatedly on hands and knees. That evening, as news spread that the Mercer cabin was empty, several townsfolk reported seeing movement in the trees northwest of the hollow. Not running, lurking. A dark shape shifting between trunks, stopping abruptly whenever someone looked toward it. A teenage boy claimed he saw Elias crouched near the old cemetery fence, though he fled before confirming it. On May 18th, the real escalation occurred. 3 hounds belonging to the Parson family vanished. The next morning, one returned, trembling, bleeding slightly from its paws and refusing to enter the barn. The other 2 were never found. The dog's injuries showed no signs of attack, only exertion, as if it had run until exhaustion. That same night, a farmer swore he heard someone calling from the tree line, not words but fragmented syllables. He described the voice as a man trying to speak through broken instructions. And across the ridge, deep in the birch stands, someone reported a long, shuddering wail that did not match any known animal of the Appalachians. Fear tightened around Briar Creek like a rope, not because something was stalking the hollow, but because it seemed to be learning how. By late May, Briar Creek residents spoke in hushed tones, avoiding even the mention of the Mercers' names. Folks who once dismissed the early sightings now kept lanterns burning deep into the night. The sense of unease was no longer tied to what had been heard or glimpsed, but to what was happening in the margins of the hollow, footpaths shifting subtly, livestock behaving strangely, and an uncanny quiet settling before dusk each evening. Marshal Coates, stretched thin, visited the cabin once more on May 20th. Morning light revealed new disturbances, overturned stones, tufts of moss torn up in irregular lines, and the faint outline of a dragging pattern leading toward a thicket. This time Coates followed. The trail led into a dense section of forest where the ground sloped sharply downward. The soil there was dark, packed with roots, and had an unusual quality, soft at the surface but firm underneath, as if repeatedly pressed and released. Coates crouched and examined it. Kneeling indentations, heel marks, fingertip divots, a pattern of frantic crawling. Then he found the shirt, torn, damp, a button missing. It matched the one Elias had been wearing days earlier. At the edge of the thicket, Coates discovered a hollow beneath an uprooted tree. Inside lay bedding of leaves compacted by weight, human weight. Nearby, he found a small wooden box containing mementos, a rusted drinking tin, several folded scraps of paper, and a thin strip of cloth tied into a careful knot. The papers held childish handwriting, memories, maybe, written with long pauses between letters, as though the writer struggled to command their own hand. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Hold still. Hold still. Hold still. A shiver went down Coates' spine. He pocketed one scrap for analysis and returned to the hollow, his horse uneasy beneath him. That night, Briar Creek was shaken again. Around 11 p.m., a group of teenagers driving home from a church gathering reported seeing a figure on the old mining road. Their accounts varied slightly, but all agreed on key details. It was tall, moving in spasms, and its head jerked independently of the rest of its body. One teen said it looked like it was trying to straighten itself but couldn't. Another claimed he heard a clicking sound like teeth snapping out of rhythm. When the headlights struck it, the figure didn't shield its eyes. It simply froze, not in fear, but as though waiting for an instruction. The teenagers drove off, speeding all the way back to town. The next morning, Coates searched the mining road and found something that troubled him more than any sighting. A vertical scrape on the trunk of an oak, about chest height, as if someone had pressed their forehead against it repeatedly. The bark was worn, but no trace of blood remained. He found several more along the trail, forehead-height impressions spaced irregularly, each one paired with deep finger marks below. Nearby, he noticed something else. Grass bent in tight circles, as though someone had turned in place over and over. Doctors reviewing the evidence later would compare these behaviors to extreme neurological deterioration, movements seen in advanced stages of certain genetic disorders. The same kinds of involuntary spasms and behavioral disorientation that researchers studying Huntington's disease had documented in case files from the late 20th century. But in Briar Creek, what emerged along the mining road felt like something beyond illness, something accelerating, something adapting. On May 23rd, the hollow experienced its first disappearance. A woodcutter named Joel Farn left at dawn to gather fallen branches near the ridge. By afternoon, his mule returned alone, rope trailing, eyes wide. Joel never came home. That evening, the wind carried a muffled cry from somewhere deep in the hills. It was faint, distant, like a man trying to remember how to use his own voice. No one volunteered to search after dark. Joel Farn's disappearance marked a turning point for Briar Creek. Until then, the disturbances had stayed at the edge of the hollow, strange, frightening, but distant. Joel's empty return path, his mule trembling beneath the weight of something unseen, forced the community to confront the possibility that whatever afflicted the Mercer family had spilled beyond their cabin and into the wider mountains. By the morning of May 24th, Marshal Coates organized a search party. Only 6 men agreed to join him. The rest of the town, fearful, superstitious, or simply exhausted, shut their doors and waited. The search team traced Joel's last known route along a narrow ridge path. The earth was soft from recent rains, and yet there were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate where Joel had gone. Instead, the men found irregular indentations in the soil, deep toe marks, then nothing, then a heel mark, then a palm shape. As though someone had moved in an uncoordinated scramble, stopping and lurching unpredictably. Farther up the ridge, they discovered a pair of tree trunks scarred with long vertical smears, spaced the width of human shoulders. The bark was rubbed raw, flecked with damp moss and faint residues that glimmered slightly, sweat perhaps or something else. Coates pressed a cloth to the marks and sniffed. The same metallic odor he had smelled near the Mercer cabin lingered in the air. "Silas Brune," the trapper muttered. "It ain't huntin' wrong. This is movin' wrong." The phrase appeared later in Coates' report. Near midday, the searchers reached a small depression where the ground dipped into a shallow bowl. There at the center lay Joel Farn's hat. It was flattened as though forced downward by considerable weight. Beside it was a patch of soil churned into a spiral pattern, unmistakably similar to the one found behind the Mercer cabin. The men exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, Carter Riggs, refused to continue. He pointed toward the trees, where the faint impression of a figure stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless. The shape was thin, bent, as if suspended awkwardly between movements. When Coates took a step toward it, the figure slipped backward into the undergrowth without sound. The team retreated shortly after, fear outweighing duty. Only Coates lingered, staring into the trees. He later wrote that he had the impression, though he could not prove it, that the figure was watching not out of malice but confusion, as though it were trying to recognize him. By evening, the hollow carried a taut silence. Families shuttered their homes, livestock pressed nervously against barn walls. Coates reviewed the day's notes at his desk, comparing them to Dorothy Kellam's letter and older references he had begun to uncover. One document, a fragile newspaper clipping from 1948, described a mountain family born with twisted motions, whose members would wander into the woods when the fever set in, returning weeks later with bruises, scratches, and no memory of what had happened. Another mentioned a man who walked like he was borrowed from another skeleton. The parallels with the Mercers were impossible to ignore. That night, shortly after midnight, 3 households reported the same sound, a rhythmic thudding, slow and deliberate, like a heavy body tapping against the base of a tree. Each listener described it differently. One said it was like a heartbeat in the wood. Another said, like knuckles learning how to knock. None dared investigate. Just before dawn, a final report came from the eastern edge of Briar Creek. A farmer rising early to tend his field saw a figure standing near the fork in the trail. For a moment he thought it was Elias Mercer, thin, hunched, trembling. Then the figure straightened abruptly, too fast as though pulled upright by strings. It turned toward him with a jerking motion, head tilting sharply. The farmer fled. By sunrise, Briar Creek understood. Whatever the Mercers had carried into the mountains had begun wandering beyond them. The morning after the farmer's sighting, a faint tension gripped Briar Creek, one that felt less like fear and more like expectation, as if the town collectively sensed that something was approaching its threshold. The marshal's office received 3 separate reports before noon, each describing a similar figure seen at different points near the hollow's perimeter. In every recounting, the descriptions matched Elias Mercer's distorted posture, arms trembling, neck twisting, limbs moving out of sequence. Yet each witness insisted the distance between their sightings made it impossible for the same individual to have traveled so quickly. Marshal Coates began compiling these testimonies alongside older local records. A pattern emerged, echoing the scattered research he'd found in the days prior. Families in isolated mountain regions experiencing severe hereditary neurological decline, wandering habits, and episodes of physical disorientation. It reminded him of the early case studies referenced in discussions of Huntington's disease: repeated involuntary movements, unpredictable gait, and fragmented speech. But what Briar Creek faced was something accelerated, externalized, and now, seemingly, multiplying. On May 27th, a group of field workers clearing brush along the southern slopes stumbled upon what would become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. Lying in a shallow ditch was a length of rope knotted into loops, coated with a thin film of dried sweat and a faint granular residue. The rope appeared to have been chewed or torn apart in sections, with frayed ends scattered along the ground. Beside it was a stone, smooth, rounded, and deeply indented with 4 parallel grooves, as if someone had gripped it repeatedly with unnatural strength. Coates held the stone in his hand and felt an odd tremor through it, though he later admitted it was likely his imagination. Further uphill, they discovered a large patch of soil pressed down in a pattern similar to earlier findings: spirals, palm marks, knuckle imprints, and dragging motions that suggested something fleshy had pushed outward in wide circles. Hale, one of the field workers, remarked quietly, "It looks like something tried to steady itself, or learn how." Her words unsettled the group deeply. That evening, the first clear vocalization was reported: A family living near the old church heard a long, broken cry echo through the woods. The sound rose in pitch, fell abruptly, then returned in short stuttering bursts. It was neither animal nor human, but something caught between. The youngest son insisted the cry sounded like a man trying to say a word but only forming part of the sound. "Not help," he said, "just the beginning of it." Coates rode out with 2 deputies, lanterns swinging in the dark. They found nothing except disturbed leaves near a fence line and a tuft of hair caught on a nail, gray, coarse, and strangely warm to the touch. Lab analysis days later would determine the hair belonged to no known species, though the report was inconclusive due to contamination. The following morning, several residents found small objects left on their porches: a wooden spoon, a cracked mirror shard, a strip of cloth tied in that same careful knot found near the uprooted tree. None belonged to the households that received them. Some bore the faint scent of pine and iron. Others showed signs of having been handled repeatedly, thumbprints smeared in semicircles, as though traced by trembling hands. Fear grew in Briar Creek, not because something was attacking, but because something seemed to be observing, learning, and returning items as if testing recognition. By May's end, sightings increased along the mountain trails. Each account described figures that moved in disjointed ways, pausing in mid-motion or twitching violently before continuing. They appeared confused, not predatory, but their numbers were growing. In the final entry of that week, Coates wrote in his log, "Symptoms dispersed, not contained to one man. This is no illness of the body alone. Something hereditary is unfolding outward into the land." That line, more than any other, would later be referenced in academic debates about the Mercer case, particularly those exploring how a genetic affliction could manifest so visibly, so collectively, and so quickly in the isolated folds of the Appalachian Mountains. June arrived with an oppressive heat that settled in the hollow like a living weight. Even the mountain winds felt stalled. Locals took this as a bad sign. In Appalachia, stillness is seldom neutral. And during that first week of June, the sightings intensified, not in violence but in proximity. The figures once glimpsed at the ridge now appeared nearer to homes, fences, and even the churchyard. It was around this time that Marshall Coates began referring to the phenomenon as the Mercer condition, not officially, but in his private notes. He traced every detail he could find in old medical journals, county records, and oral histories. The patterns mirrored certain neurological declines resembling those seen in mid-20th century Huntington's case studies: coordinated failure of motor control, spasmodic gestures, and periods of cognitive dissociation. But the pacing, so abrupt, so dramatic, defied medical explanation. Meanwhile, residents of Briar Creek noticed something else. The afflicted figures seemed to avoid direct contact. They lingered at a distance, watching, swaying in irregular rhythms, like people listening to instructions no one else could hear. On June 3rd, 3 field hands clearing brush near the old orchard reported a strange arrangement on the ground. Set neatly between 2 trees were small objects: a button, a metal buckle, a folded page torn from a diary, and a piece of fabric tied, again, into that same meticulous knot. But this time the knot was tighter, more intentional, as if practiced. One field hand remarked that the placement reminded him of a child offering something to be recognized. Later that evening, a more alarming discovery surfaced. A retired coal miner named Abram Weller heard a disturbance near his shed: soft steps, a shifting weight, then hush. When he opened the door, he found a figure standing at the tree line, trembling so violently it seemed as if its bones might burst from its skin. Its arms hung too low, its knees bent inward. It tilted its head with a jarring snap. Abram dropped his lantern. The figure lurched backward but didn't flee. It lifted one shaking hand and pressed it against a tree, fingers scraping down the bark as though trying to leave a message. Then it slid into the undergrowth, vanishing without sound. Coates investigated the next morning. He found elongated smears on the tree where the figure had stood, 4-finger marks, a palm impression too wide to be natural, and streaks in the soil as if a body had shifted weight repeatedly while struggling to stay upright. He also discovered footprints, but they conflicted with logic. Some prints appeared normal, bare human feet, narrow and arching. Others, overlapping them, were twisted, the toes splayed outward, the heel dragging as though the foot had altered shape mid-step. The prints led toward a dense thicket and then abruptly stopped. No direction of departure could be found. As Coates knelt to study them, he felt the air chain, the way it had near the Mercer cabin, heavy, metallic, expectant. Throughout the hollow, livestock began refusing to graze near shaded areas. Dogs, usually fearless mountain breeds, growled at empty corners of barns. One family woke to find their screen door scratched from the outside, not slashed but traced, as though someone had been experimenting with the shape of their own hand. By June 8th, the phenomenon reached its most disturbing stage yet. A young girl named Maddie Turner told her mother she'd seen a man who looked like he was learning to stand. When pressed, she said, he kept trying to lift his head like he forgot how. Her mother immediately contacted Coates, who arrived alarmed. Maddie's description matched others: long limbs, jerky posture, the tremor of a mind fighting itself. But one detail was new. Maddie said the man kept gesturing toward her, small, trembling motions, like he was trying to give her something. What was he holding? Coates asked gently. Maddie thought for a long moment, then answered. Nothing, just his hands, like he didn't understand what they were for. That sentence chilled Coates more than any sighting yet. It suggested that whatever afflicted the Mercers was no longer merely a genetic condition spiraling out of control. It was evolving, it was imitating, and worst of all, it was noticing them. By mid-June, Briar Creek had the uneasy sense of a place being studied. Doors were locked earlier. Lamps burned longer. And yet, the figures afflicted by the Mercer bloodline seemed to draw ever closer to homes and fields, not aggressively, but with the hesitant, trembling curiosity of something still learning how to inhabit its own body. On June 12th, the most detailed sighting yet occurred. A logger named Wesley Darr was returning from the northern slope when he heard what he first assumed was a deer hobbling through the brush. But the gait was inconsistent: 3 steps, a stagger, then a rapid shuffling motion. When Wesley raised his lantern, the figure halted. He described it as Elias Mercer, or something that had once been Elias. The man's spine buckled unnaturally, his shoulders misaligned, his arms suspended in quivering arcs. But it was Elias' face, or the attempt at one, that disturbed Wesley most. The expression moved in wrong directions, as though each muscle received contradictory signals. Lips pulled tight when they should have loosened. Eyes focused at different distances. Elias, or the shape that remained, lifted one shaking hand and tapped his chest as if trying to identify himself. Wesley bolted. Behind him, he heard the figure attempt a sound, short, clipped, like a person trying to speak through broken machinery. Marshal Coates investigated the site the next morning. There he found the unmistakable signs: 2 deep impressions in the soil where knees had pressed, parallel streaks in the moss as though fingers had dragged through it, and a single handprint, elongated, asymmetrical, pressed into the wet earth. But the truly disturbing discovery sat atop a rotting log nearby, a bundle of items tied with the familiar Mercer knot. Inside were 3 objects: a button, a leaf folded neatly into a square, and a scrap of coarse fabric. Coates recognized the fabric instantly. It was part of Joel Farn's shirt, the woodcutter who had disappeared weeks earlier. This suggested an alarming possibility. The afflicted were not merely wandering, they were collecting. Later that afternoon, a second report came from the southern ridge. Two hikers, locals familiar with the terrain, claimed they saw multiple figures standing in the undergrowth, spaced evenly apart, swaying in slight rhythmic motions. Not hiding, not stalking, just waiting. As the hikers approached, the figures slowly crouched, their limbs compressing inward like folding metal. One tilted its head upward abruptly, neck bending too far. The hikers fled before seeing more. Coates logged these sightings and, in frustration, contacted a regional medical researcher, Dr. Marvin Klein, who had previously studied hereditary neurological disorders in the Appalachian region. Klein listened carefully, then said something that unsettled Coates more than any sighting. "If this is genetic," Klein said, "then it's following a pattern, just not one we understand. Neural decline can cause involuntary movement, yes, but not coordinated behavior across multiple individuals, not environmental interaction, not mimicry." He paused before adding, "and certainly not collected behavior." Dr. Klein agreed to meet Coates at Briar Creek the following week, but before he arrived, the phenomenon escalated again. On June 15th, 3 families awoke to find faint marks etched into the ground outside their homes. Not scratches, not footprints, but symbols, circles, spirals, and intersecting lines drawn with a trembling but deliberate hand. One spiral contained a small object at its center, a pebble wrapped tightly in cloth. Another held a feather. Another, a child's lost shoelace. Coates studied these carefully. The symbols were crude, but they shared a pattern with the spirals found behind the Mercer cabin and near Joel Farn's disappearance site. Someone, or something, was learning how to leave messages. And the Hollow felt watched, not by a predator, but by a mind fracturing and reforming in ways no one could predict. That night, just before midnight, the church bell clanged once, though no one had touched the rope. Families rushed outside. In the distant trees they saw shapes, dozens of them, swaying faintly, as though answering a call. The single toll of the church bell echoed across Briar Creek like a warning from an older time, one of those mountain signals meant for storms, fires, or dangers without names. Families stood on porches, gripping lanterns, scanning the distant dark for movement. And movement came. Not a surge, not a chase, but a quiet, coordinated drift of silhouettes emerging along the edges of the hollow. Marshall Coates later described the scene in his notebook. "They stood as if listening. The posture was wrong, the timing was wrong, but the gathering, that was intentional." The figures lingered near the tree line, thin, trembling, jittering at the joints. Some crouched. Others leaned forward at impossible angles. A few shifted abruptly, jerking like film frames missing between motions. Coates, accompanied by 2 deputies, approached cautiously with lanterns raised. As the light swept across the first line of trees, something unexpected happened. Several of the figures raised their hands slowly, shakily, almost in mimicry of greeting. It was not menacing. It was not friendly. It was learned. One deputy whispered, "They're copying us." Coates took another step, and the nearest figure took an unsteady step back, as though mirroring distance. It bent at the knees, spine trembling as if unsure how to hold its own weight. A lantern flame flickered. In that instant, Coates saw the face. Once it had been Elias Mercer, but now the jaw worked independently of speech. The eyes darted with conflicting intent, and the skin twitched around the cheekbones as though muscles fired without order. Yet beneath the distortion there was recognition, broken, flickering, but present. Coates lifted his lantern higher. Elias, or what remained of him, jerked violently in response. Not out of fear, but reaction, as though the sudden light overloaded a mind struggling to process too many commands at once. Behind Elias, more figures shifted into view. Some bore familiar shapes, Frederick among them, his limbs taut as bowstrings. Others were strangers, likely those who had gone missing in the previous weeks. Their bodies no longer obeyed symmetry or sequence. They trembled with each tiny correction their nerves attempted, but all of them shared a single behavioral thread, eyes fixed on the hollow, waiting. The silence broke when one figure at the far right collapsed forward, not falling naturally but folding mid-motion. It scrambled upright with a violent twitch, then pressed its hand to a tree trunk and shook uncontrollably. The trembling traveled from arm to spine to legs, as though its body had become a misfiring circuit. Coates and the deputies retreated slowly, careful not to trigger sudden reactions. As they moved back toward the church, the figures in the woods swayed, leaned, and crouched, mimicking, adjusting, responding, but none advanced. By dawn, the silhouettes had dissolved back into the forest. Only disturbed soil, bending grass, and faint imprints of knees remained. That morning, Dr. Marvin Klein arrived. He listened to every account with growing unease. After examining the symbols drawn in soil and reviewing Coates' notes about the Mercers' progressive symptoms, he delivered an assessment that chilled everyone present. "This is not a contagion," he said quietly. "It's not madness, it's not even violence." He hesitated. "It's coordination." When pressed, Klein explained that while genetic disorders such as Huntington's can cause erratic movements, involuntary spasms, and mental decline, they do not cause synchronized behaviors across multiple afflicted individuals. "And yet," he said, "they gathered when the bell rang." Klein requested to observe the ridge himself. Coates agreed. They traveled to the tree line that afternoon. The forest was still, too still. Klein crouched near one of the spiral markings in the soil. He ran his finger along its edge, then examined the center where a small feather lay. "This is pattern-seeking," he murmured. "A brain trying to organize chaos." Coates asked, trying to speak. Klein did not answer. That night, as Briar Creek tried to settle, the wind carried a single fractured call from the mountains, a voice struggling against its own design. And though no one saw them, several residents swore they sensed the same presence near their homes, watching, learning, waiting. The next phase of the investigation began quietly, almost cautiously. Dr. Klein insisted on returning to the ridge at first light, hoping to observe whatever patterns might emerge during the morning hours. Briar Creek felt suspended between fear and reluctant curiosity. Doors cracked open, curtains lifted slightly, every household listening for footsteps that never quite came close enough. Coates accompanied Klein up the narrow trail, both men noting how the forest seemed strangely altered. The usual chorus of Appalachian birdsong was muted, and even the rustling of small animals had dwindled. Klein remarked that such environmental quiet often preceded seismic shifts or weather fronts, but the air was mild and the ground vibrated with nothing except its own breath. At the site where the figures had gathered the night before, they found new markings. The soil bore the impressions of feet, human but skewed. The arches were collapsed, the toes splayed outward. Many footprints overlapped, creating a swirling pattern as if the afflicted had circled repeatedly, perhaps awaiting a signal. Klein knelt to inspect one track more closely. "This isn't random," he murmured. "The motor deterioration is severe, but they're following coordination cues. External ones, perhaps." Coates didn't understand. "So they're responding to what?" Klein shook his head. "To each other, to instinct, or something encoded deeper than either." A brittle silence followed. They moved farther into the woods, passing clusters of moss bent in tight arcs, signs the afflicted had knelt or crouched in the night. Then near a natural hollow between two oaks they found something new, a small arrangement of stones forming a ring, inside of which sat a piece of torn cloth tied into the Mercer knot. A message, a symbol, a ritual. The meaning was unclear, but the intent was undeniable. Klein's face paled noticeably. This is associative behavior, he said. Common in primates, rare in late-stage neurological illness, impossible in coordinated groups. Yes. Coates replied quietly, "Nothing about this is illness anymore." They marked the site and returned to town, hoping for time to interpret what they had seen. They were not afforded that luxury. Shortly after dusk, a scream split the hollow. It came from the east side of Briar Creek. Families rushed outside with lanterns, gathering at the Harbaugh residence where the cry had originated. Mr. Harbaugh stood shaking on his porch, pointing toward the barn. Coates, breathless, followed the crowd. Inside the barn doorway was a series of distorted handprints, some smeared, some pressed cleanly into the wood. The prints traveled up the frame in uneven intervals, as though the figure had struggled to climb or stabilize itself. But what held the crowd in stunned silence were the marks on the hay-strewn floor, deep impressions of knees, shins, and palms circling the barn interior, as though a body had crawled rapidly in a wide loop. At the center of that circle lay a single object. Harbaugh's lantern, extinguished but clean, placed intentionally upright. Dr. Klein examined the scene carefully. "They're testing boundaries," he said, "approaching structures, mimicking human patterns, trying to belong." One frightened neighbor snapped back, "Belonging doesn't come with scratching up barns at night." But Klein shook his head. "This is not aggression, this is searching." Coates stepped outside, scanning the tree line. The lanterns behind him flickered against the dark, casting trembling silhouettes. And then, for just a moment, he saw a shape, thin, crooked, trembling, standing between two distant pines. Its head tilted toward the barn as if listening, learning. Before he could speak, it slipped back into the forest with a jerk of its limbs. That night, few slept in Briar Creek, and those who did awoke periodically to the feeling that something was passing near their walls, not touching, not entering, simply mapping the town as if preparing for something neither illness nor instinct could explain. Something approaching the boundary of identity. By June 18th, Briar Creek had entered a state best described in later county reports as heightened collective vigilance. People did not panic, they simply watched. Every window became an observation post. Every porch light burned deep into the night. And yet the figures afflicted by the Mercer bloodline continued to drift along the forest margins, appearing only briefly, as if rehearsing their presence rather than asserting it. Marshal Coates, exhausted but determined, convened a meeting with Dr. Klein in the church basement. There, surrounded by hymnals and folding chairs, they sorted through the mounting pile of field notes, soil rubbings, witness statements, and crude sketches of the distorted figures. The evidence painted a picture neither man wished to articulate. "These aren't episodes," Klein finally said. "They're stages." Coates frowned. "Stages of what?" Klein hesitated. "Of adaptation." Before Coates could respond, Sarah Parson burst into the room, breathless. She had seen something new, a figure near the creek bed. "It wasn't wandering," she said, voice trembling. "It was arranging things." The three of them hurried to the site. Lanterns swung wildly as they descended the slope, illuminating thin sheets of mist rolling over the water. When they reached the creek, the beam of Coates' lamp caught a peculiar scene. Stones had been placed along the bank in a pattern, 6 of them, arranged in a line that curved subtly toward the water. Beside them lay a stick with deliberate hash marks etched across it. And farther still, a circle pressed into the damp earth, smoothed with the palm of a trembling hand. Coates knelt beside the stones. These weren't dropped, these were chosen. Klein nodded grimly. "This is representational behavior." Early symbolic thought. "But how?" Sarah whispered. "They can barely walk." Klein did not answer. He simply studied the circle in the soil, tracing its rim with gloved fingers. Then they found the cloth. A small square of fabric tied into the Mercer knot. Only this time the knot had been repeated 3 times, stacked tightly, almost obsessively. Klein exhaled sharply. This is refinement. A sound cut through the air. A wet rustling, soft and deliberate. From the opposite bank something moved, a figure, half-crouched, head twitching as though listening to multiple directions at once. When the lantern light brushed it, the figure didn't flee. It straightened in a slow, staggering rise, arms trembling violently. Its face, what could be seen of it, twitched with the effort of recognition. Coates froze. The figure lifted its hand, not in greeting, in mimicry. It was copying Coates' posture, lantern arm raised, elbow bent. But the motion was broken, stuttering, as though the signal inside its brain traveled by fragments. Then, with a sharp, uncoordinated twist, the figure stepped backward into shadow and disappeared among the reeds. Sarah gasped. Klein swallowed hard. "It's studying us," he murmured. "Not hunting, not fleeing, studying." On their way back to town, Coates noticed something he did not share aloud: footprints following their path. Fresh, uneven, overlapping with their own boot marks. Not stalking, just following, tracing. That night, a soft tapping was heard on 3 different porches across Briar Creek. Not knocking, not scratching. Tapping, hesitant, rhythmic, as though testing the sound of human communication. No one opened their doors, and by dawn the tapping had stopped. But the impressions in the dirt, those crooked, shifting footprints, remained, circling each home that had been visited, then trailing back toward the dark woods of the Appalachian Ridge. The Hollow realized something quietly terrifying. The afflicted were no longer wandering at random. They were mapping. By June 20th, the afflicted no longer moved like outliers stumbling through the perimeter of Briar Creek. Their presence had become patterned, measured. It was clear to anyone watching from a window or porch that these figures were not drifting blindly through the Appalachians. They were learning the Hollow. That morning, before the sun fully crested the ridge, 3 sets of prints were found beside the church. The spacing was irregular, the toes skewed, but the paths converged toward the same point, the bell tower. Beneath the tower, Coates discovered fresh marks on the wooden support beams, handprints pressed inward, as though several trembling limbs had attempted to understand their structure. The bell rope itself bore faint smears of dried sweat. Whatever had rung the bell earlier that week had not been a coincidence. Later that day, a new kind of report reached the marshal's office. Mrs. Ida Roker, an elderly woman living on the northern rise, claimed she'd seen 2 afflicted figures standing side by side, their bodies swaying in near synchrony. She watched them for nearly 2 minutes before they jerked apart and vanished. 2, together, coordinated. Up to this point, most sightings had described solitary, struggling individuals. But this suggested something else, an emergent system, perhaps, or fragmented mind seeking cohesion. Dr. Klein grew more uneasy with each passing hour. His field notes from this period contain lines written in quick, unsteady handwriting. Collective orientation, unusual in degenerative disorders. Shared cues, mutual mimicry, impossible to explain genetically. Behavior suggests a forming network. That evening, while Klein and Coates examined the churchyard prints, a group of teenagers ran into town shouting. They had been near the old orchard and claimed to have seen a figure crouched at the base of a tree, scraping lines into the dirt with a stick. When the teens approached, the figure froze, tilted its head, then quickly erased the markings with its forearm before disappearing into the underbrush with unnatural speed. Coates led a team to investigate. At the orchard, they found remnants of the erased pattern, a circle bisected by a jagged line, flanked by 3 short slashes. Beside it lay the stick used to draw it, worn smooth by trembling hands. Klein crouched beside the pattern fragments. "This is deliberate," he whispered. "They're testing abstraction." Coates asked, abstraction of what? Before Klein could answer, something cracked in the woods behind them. Every lantern swung toward the sound. A shape moved, just for a moment, thin, lurching, trying to straighten itself. Then another shape behind it, and a third. The orchard fell silent. Then the first figure stepped into the lantern light. It wasn't Elias or Frederick. It was Joel Farn, the woodcutter who had gone missing weeks earlier. His limbs jerked in halting patterns. His jaw twitched as though working out a forgotten word. And yet through all the trembling and distortion, there was a glimmer of awareness in his eyes, a faint recognition. Joel. Coates called gently. Joel's body spasmed. He took one step forward, mimicking the slight lean in Coates' stance. Behind him, two more afflicted moved closer, their feet scraping softly in alternating rhythms, as though syncing their motions to Joel's. Klein whispered, "They're organizing." Joel reached out a shaking hand, fingers splayed. His arm trembled violently from shoulder to wrist, but his motion had clear intent. He was trying to offer something. Then they saw it. A loop of rope tied into the Mercer knot clutched in his hand. Joel turned his head sharply, as if listening to instructions only he could hear. Then, with a sudden collapsing motion, he and the other two figures retreated, jerking, staggering, dragging their limbs but maintaining formation as they vanished between the orchard trees. Not random, not feral, but rehearsed. When Coates returned to town, he wrote only one line in his evening log. Whatever this is, it is no longer happening to them alone. It's happening between them. And in the quiet of the hollow, Briar Creek felt the truth settle. The afflicted were no longer merely learning the world. They were beginning to teach each other. By June 22nd, Briar Creek had transformed from a quiet Appalachian hollow into something like a living map, one being actively studied, traced, and memorized by minds no longer bounded by the limits of coherent movement. Families awoke each morning to new patterns in their gardens, spirals pressed into soil, parallel drag marks beneath windows, and small objects left neatly on porches. A spoon, a pebble, a snapped twig, each tied with the Mercer knot. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. Everything was arranged. That morning, Marshal Coates and Dr. Klein walked the perimeter of town to assess how far these behaviors had spread. They found more evidence than either had anticipated. Near the old sawmill, deep indentations marked the ground where several afflicted had apparently knelt, pressing their palms into the packed earth in what looked almost like a coordinated posture. Beside one imprint lay a torn page from a children's book, the edges soft with handling, the surface smudged with fingerprints that trembled into blurred arcs. At a creek crossing, the mud bore footprints of different sizes, some narrow and human-like, others twisted by the aberrant movements the Mercer men had displayed. Yet all the prints followed a shared direction, a silent migration toward the ridge. "They're not just wandering anymore," Klein murmured. "They're converging." Coates asked the question on everyone's mind. Converging for what? Before an answer could form, a distant sound echoed through the trees, a slow, rhythmic tapping. Not animal, not wind. Something deliberate, spaced like a metronome struggling to maintain time. They followed the sound uphill, lanterns bobbing even in daylight's dim underbrush. Near a scatter of boulders they found the source. A figure, thin, shaking at every joint, sat hunched beside a fallen log. Its head jerked between positions as though trying to focus on multiple sounds at once. The tapping came from a stone clutched in its hand, striking the log in rhythmic intervals. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap. A pattern, a primitive attempt at structure. The figure froze when the men approached, stone dropping from its hand. Then with great effort it turned its face toward them. The facial muscles misfired, creating a grotesque echo of recognition. Klein whispered, "It's communicating." The figure extended one trembling arm. Its fingers splayed, curled, opened again. Then it pressed its hand into the dirt and drew a crude shape, a circle with 5 jagged lines radiating outward. Coates crouched slowly. "What does that mean?" Before the figure could repeat the motion, a violent tremor passed through its body. It lurched forward, spasms racking its limbs. Then in a burst of chaotic motion it scrambled into the brush and vanished. The tapping ceased. That afternoon, Briar Creek found itself confronted with the first coordinated incursion into town. 3 households along Birch Lane discovered identical soil patterns outside their homes, 2 spirals connected by a line. At the center of each spiral sat an object, a feather, a ribbon, a wooden button. At the Parson residence, the pattern was accompanied by a whispered sound heard around twilight, a strained, fragmented syllable. Mrs. Parson described it in her statement. It was like someone trying to say, "Come." But the word wasn't finished, just the beginning of it stuck in their throat. Klein's analysis grew more troubled. "These aren't random offerings," he explained. "They're attempts at reference, attempts at alignment." Coates frowned. "Alignment with what?" Klein didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "With us." That night near the ridge, lanterns flickered in farmhouses as residents listened to the forest breathe. Somewhere in the dark, the afflicted moved, not as individuals but with emerging cohesion. They swayed in broken harmony. They traced circles in the earth. They tapped. They waited. Briar Creek understood in its bones. The afflicted were no longer merely responding. They were preparing. June 24th began with a tension so pervasive it seemed to seep from the bark of the trees themselves. Folks in Briar Creek described waking with a feeling that the hollow had shifted in the night, that the air was thicker, that the woods had crept a little closer, that something just beyond perception had reorganized itself. Marshal Coates made his morning rounds with Dr. Klein at his side. They walked past homes where families stood on porches holding coffee cups with both hands, as if anchoring themselves against a world that no longer behaved predictably. Dogs refused to leave their yards. Crows perched silently on fence posts, watching the ridges with uncharacteristic stillness. Then the first discovery of the day surfaced. On the path leading to the old cemetery hill, someone had arranged fallen branches into an unmistakable formation. A rough human figure, arms outstretched, legs bending slightly inward. At the center of the figure's chest sat a stone. Beneath it, pressed into damp earth, was the Mercer knot, tied into a scrap of cloth so tightly it had cut grooves into itself. Klein crouched over the arrangement. "This is representational," he said quietly. "They're modeling us." Coates muttered, "Or warning us." Farther uphill they found more markings. Long parallel lines dragged through the soil, palm-sized indentations clustered in erratic patterns, and something new, scratches on a birch tree that formed a crude shape resembling a hand. Not a natural one. The fingers were too long, the spacing uneven, like a trembling attempt to imitate human proportions. Around noon, a panicked shout rose from the southern edge of town. The Harrington boys had run home screaming after encountering 3 afflicted figures standing shoulder to shoulder near an abandoned corn crib. The boys described the figures as swaying, not chaotically, but rhythmically, as though following an internal beat. When the lantern the boys carried flickered, the figures tilted their heads in unison toward the light. Klein took this harder than Coates expected. "Synchronization," he said. "This is emerging coordination. They're not just mimicking us anymore, they're mimicking each other." That afternoon, the Hollow experienced something even stranger. A series of knocks echoed across Briar Creek. Not loud, not frantic. Soft, patterned, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, long pause, 3 again. Residents stepped onto porches, scanning the woods. The knocks came not from a single point but from multiple directions, echoing across the ridgeline as though the afflicted were calling to one another. Coates and Klein moved toward the sound and found new tracks, human-sized but twisted, leading toward the old mining road. Following them, they reached a clearing and froze. There, arranged in a wide circle, were at least 10 symbols pressed into the ground. Spirals, lines, marks resembling crude arrows, and at the center of the circle lay a small stack of items. A hand-carved wooden spoon, a scrap of blue fabric, a cracked pocket mirror. A strip of rope tied into the Mercer knot. Klein whispered, "This is social structure, a primitive one but unmistakable." "They're communicating," Coates said, "with us or with each other." The tapping resumed in the distance, then stopped, then resumed again, closer this time. Coates raised his lantern. Shapes moved at the forest edge. Dozens, their limbs trembled, their heads jerked, but they moved with a strange, shared cadence as though guided by an unseen pulse. One stepped forward, its hand rising in a broken imitation of human greeting. Another mirrored it, then a third, a chorus of twitching silhouettes acknowledging their observers. Klein swallowed hard. "They're not hunting, they're evolving." The figures drifted back into the woods in pieces, one limb at a time, one jerking pivot at a time, until the forest swallowed them whole. Briar Creek held its breath, and Coates wrote in his notebook that evening, "If this continues, they will not stay at the edges. They are not merely learning us, they are preparing to join us." The hollow prayed he was wrong. June 26th brought with it a heavy fog, unusual for that time of year, rolling down from the ridge in thick folds that clung to every fence post and window pane. The hollow woke to a muffled world where sound seemed dulled, and shapes in the distance wavered uncertainly. Briar Creek residents later said it felt like the mountains were breathing onto the town. Marshal Coates, already up before dawn, noticed immediately that something had shifted. The fog moved in pulses, gathering heavily near the paths that led toward the forest. As he stepped onto the main road, he saw sets of footprints emerging from the mist, fresh, uneven impressions that wandered but did not scatter. Instead, they moved in parallel lines as though multiple afflicted had traveled together. Dr. Klein joined him moments later, lantern in hand despite the daylight. "They were close last night," he murmured, "closer than before." Their first discovery lay near the carpenter's shed. Arranged neatly on the ground were 5 small bundles of leaves tied with strips of cloth, each one knotted in the Mercer fashion. But the knots were no longer sloppy or frantic. They were tight. Symmetrical, practiced. Coates crouched beside them. "They're refining the knot," he said, "making it cleaner." Klein looked grim. That level of fine motor control should be impossible in late-stage neurological degeneration. Before Coates could respond, a distant tapping echoed through the fog, soft, rhythmic, and close enough that both men stiffened. They followed the sound toward the creek, where the fog thinned just enough to reveal new soil markings. Symbols, dozens of them. Some were spirals, some circles, some elongated shapes that mirrored human limbs. But one symbol appeared repeatedly, a crooked figure with one raised arm. The same posture the afflicted had mimicked days earlier. Klein whispered, "That is intentional communication." Then came the second sound, far more human. A single, broken syllable. Not a word, not even half of one. Just breath forced over trembling vocal cords. "Lad." It was enough to freeze both men. They scanned the fog until a shape materialized at the creek's edge. A tall figure, bent at the spine, arms trembling at its sides, its head tilted in sharp, intermittent jerks as if receiving fragmented instructions. When Coates raised his lantern, the figure reacted instantly, straightening halfway, arm lifting in mimicry. Then another figure emerged beside it, and another, and then 4 more behind them. A small cluster stood in the mist, bodies twitching but unified by a shared posture, each lifting an unsteady arm toward the light. Klein's breath caught. They're acknowledging grouping behavior. This is collective intelligence. Coates stepped forward cautiously. Elias. He called into the fog. The figure at the front convulsed violently at the name. Its jaw snapped upward. One leg buckled, but it did not fall. It corrected itself with a spasmodic twist, then dragged a trembling hand across the air as if trying to gesture. Another broken syllable escaped its throat. Ah-H. It wasn't speech, but it was the attempt at speech. Suddenly, the figures recoiled not from Coates but from something deeper in the fog. All eyes, misaligned as they were, snapped toward the ridge. Then in a jerking, synchronized motion, they backed into the trees, vanishing so quickly it was as though the mist swallowed them whole. Coates exhaled shakily. What made them retreat? Klein stared into the fog, troubled. Not what, he said. Who, they responded to a cue, a signal, something among them with influence. As the fog began to thin, they found one final trace near the creek, a piece of cloth tied with a mercer knot placed gently on a stone. Beneath it, pressed into the soil, was the same crooked figure symbol. Only this time the figure had two upright lines beside it, not alone, no longer singular, a pair or a group. That evening, Briar Creek remained eerily silent. Lanterns glowed behind curtains. Families listened to the woods. No tapping came, no footsteps, no voices. But every resident felt the same uncanny truth. The afflicted had not withdrawn. They had reorganized. And whatever they were preparing for, it was moving closer to the heart of the hollow. June 28th dawned with an uneasy clarity, the kind that arrives after an unnatural fog. The sky was bright, the air crisp, and yet Briar Creek felt hollowed out, bracing for something it could not name. Neighbors stepped outside only long enough to scan the ridge before retreating indoors. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Marshal Coates and Dr. Klein began their morning patrol toward the northern rise, following faint trails left in the soft earth, drag marks, partial footprints, and something stranger. A line of soil disturbances as though a trembling hand had brushed the ground while moving forward. Near the old orchard they found new formations. Not spirals this time, but pairs of parallel lines intersected by a third. Over and over, drawn with shaking precision. Dozens of these symbols marked the ground like a repeated thought struggling to take form. A few included small objects, stones, acorns, a snapped branch placed carefully at their intersections. Klein knelt beside one. "They're iterating," he murmured, "refining an idea." Coates frowned. An idea of what? Before an answer could take shape, a soft clicking sound echoed from deeper in the woods. Not animal, not wind, the afflicted, but not wandering this time, not drifting, approaching. Shapes appeared slowly between the trees, 6, then 8, then more. They moved in broken steps, yet with a strange cohesion, each adjusting to the other's halting motions. Some crouched and rose in jerks. Others held an arm aloft as though frozen mid-gesture. But they moved together, a fractured procession. Then Coates saw the faces, not blank, not vacant, focused. Elias Mercer stood among them, what remained of him. His limbs shook violently, but his gaze locked onto Coates with something disturbingly close to intent. Not recognition of a friend or memory, but recognition of a pattern. Coates raised his lantern slowly, and the afflicted, almost in unison, mimicked the gesture, hundreds of trembling fingers rising into the morning light. Klein whispered, horrified, "They've formed a collective motor schema. They're not learning one at a time anymore." Elias twitched, spasmed, then took a single step forward. Behind him, every afflicted figure took the same step, delayed by fractions of a second but undeniably synchronized. Coates stepped back. The group halted. He lifted his arm, they lifted theirs. He bent slightly at the knees. Their limbs folded in erratic echoes, A crude, broken mirror. Suddenly, a voice rang out behind Coates, Sarah Parson, breathless. "They're in town, by the mill road." Coates' heart sank. He and Klein rushed down the slope toward Birch Lane, where half a dozen townsfolk pointed, pale-faced, toward the mill. There, near the rusted equipment, three afflicted figures swayed in slow rotation. They tapped on the metal surfaces experimentally, curiously creating rhythmic echoes. They had passed the boundary. They had entered the town. Children were ushered indoors, doors slammed, curtains snapped shut. Coates and Klein approached with caution. The figures turned toward them, raised their hands, tilted their heads in recognition of pattern, not person. Klein whispered, "Do you understand? They're copying the town. They're mapping our movements, our gestures, our behaviors." Then from far up the ridge, a deep guttural cry rolled through the forest. Not like the broken syllables before, something heavier, command-like. At the sound, every afflicted figure jerked violently, then retreated in staggering unison, fleeing the town's edge and disappearing into the tree line with unnerving speed. Silence fell over Briar Creek. Coates stood rigid, listening to the fading echoes. Klein's voice trembled. That wasn't a call to them. It was a call from them. Something further along in the progression. Coates didn't respond. He could. Because he saw, pressed into the soft dirt where the afflicted had stood, one final symbol. A crude outline of the hollow, and at its center a small circle pressed 3 times by a trembling fingertip, a mark, a target, a place of return. Briar Creek's brief moment of calm snapped like dry timber. The afflicted were planful now, and whatever they were coordinating, it would not remain at the edges of the hollow much longer. June 30th arrived with a stillness that felt staged, as if the Appalachian mountains themselves had paused to listen. There was no wind through the birches, no chatter of mourning birds, no rustle of small animals. Briar Creek held its breath under a sky too clear for comfort. Marshal Coates and Dr. Klein patrolled the hollow before dawn. They found nothing at first, no silhouettes, no tapping, no new symbols in the soil. And yet both men sensed an unseen presence, like eyes blinking from behind the ridge. Near the edge of the old cemetery hill, they discovered the final arrangement. A circle pressed perfectly into the soil, not spiraled, not jagged, perfect, as though countless trembling hands had smoothed it again and again until the shape became intentional. At the center lay 3 objects: a button, a folded leaf, and a strip of cloth knotted with flawless precision, the most complete Mercer knot they had ever seen. Klein crouched, stunned. "They've mastered it," he whispered. "Fine motor control under degenerative strain impossible." Coates stared at the circle. "This is a message." Yes. But whether it meant warning, belonging, or something far more complex, neither man could say. Before they could debate further, a sound drifted from the ridge. Not a cry, not tapping. A single trembling exhale carried through the trees like the breath of something vast. Shapes materialized between the trunks, not dozens, scores. The afflicted moved slowly, gathered in uneven lines at the upper slope, jerking, twitching, realigning when one stumbled. Their limbs still shook, their faces still contorted, but their collective posture had changed. They faced the hollow directly, heads tilting in fractured unison. Elias Mercer stepped forward, or whatever remained of him. His jaw opened as if to speak. A broken syllable formed. "Ah." Then another figure beside him attempted it too. Then another. The sound spread, imperfect but synchronized, a chorus of fragmented beginnings, as though they were trying desperately to shape a human word from misfiring nerves. Coates called out softly, "Elias." Elias spasmed but did not flee. His hand rose, smoothly this time, astonishingly smoothly, as if guided by a memory deeper than his failing body. He pressed his palm to his chest. Behind him, every afflicted figure repeated the gesture. Then, as one trembling mass, they turned toward the forest, toward the deeper mountains, the older ridges, the places where paths vanish into folds of land untouched by maps. They moved, halting at first, then in fractured unity up the ridge, disappearing behind a curtain of pines. Not wandering, not fleeing, departing. Within minutes, the ridge was empty. Briar Creek did not celebrate. It simply waited, unsure whether the hollow had been spared or spared for now. In the days that followed, no new sightings were reported. No tapping on the porches. No symbols in the soil. No trembling silhouettes at the tree line. But the mountains remembered. Several hikers claimed, weeks later, that they saw figures far beyond the ridge line, thin shapes swaying between distant trunks, mimicking their own arm positions as they passed. Others insisted they found circles pressed into soft moss, centered with small objects tied into perfect knots. As summer deepened, the hollow tried to breathe again, but something had changed, subtly, permanently. Briar Creek was being watched from somewhere higher up the Appalachian spine. Not by predators, not by ghosts, by minds fractured, reassembled, and reaching toward a form they could never fully become, but would never stop attempting. At night, when the wind shifted just right, some residents claimed they could hear faint, broken syllables echoing between the ridges. Not words, not language, just the beginning of something trying to speak, and trying still.